Oh, right, and we are recording now.
So Ulysses Wilkinson. So your second book is on its way here, coming to us on July 7th, 2026. Right in time as we count on the spooky season. How you feeling about that?
I'm feeling ecstatic about it because spooky season, like you said, starts on the day after the 4th of July. And now I'm coming in with an all banger with my second book, For the Road That Tolls.
Yeah. So any big, I guess you could say, changes or adjustments as opposed to the first book? And the first book release is amazing, and now you have this one. And pretty the time between both was actually pretty. I don't say pretty short, but you kind of. I know you had a lot of stories planned in advance, and it's kind of go time. It's just kind of where you was there times we had to take some breaks or anything like that, or just kind of you had the stories in mind, just kind of locked in and went through all the stories and separated them accordingly to which book they were going to be part of. I'm sure you have a bunch of other stories in your archive and that creative mind of yours that probably for a future for the future books. But how'd you format them accordingly? How'd you arrange them?
How do I format it? So that's a very good question. So besides the fact I had a bunch of these stories, like, just compiled up in my email between last year all the way when I started my writing career, which was like 4 or 3.5 years ago. And there was a central theme that I really wanted to tie into because all my life, I mean, actually my life since I graduated, high school, I've traveled a lot. I've either flown, I've either driven, and I've visited a lot of these places and cities and towns that I've really never thought about visiting. Because in my early 20s, I that's when I did a lot of traveling, from early to mid 20s. But basically all I did, just traveled everywhere from, like,
Yeah.
say, Seattle, Boston, San Antonio. And then as when I visited these places, like, I've had these memories that I've held on to, and that's when I was, converting these into like short stories about like my experiences in these places. Not like what I truly felt, but more like, oh, what goes on in these cities? How long?
Mhm.
What would happen if I stayed there for long enough? So, it was all on the theme of, like, driving, just
Yeah.
traveling. That's what the theme of my anthology book is.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's one thing this said a lot to me when you first brought up the title and the aspect, and also the cover art too, which we'll get to later on as well too. Was I love that there was a central theme, just like with your first novel. It's more contained and whatnot, but then you kind of go out of your way and also your own personal experiences too. This country, the world in general, is so big with so many different towns and cities, and I think from my own traveling experience, I know there's a lot of like stories to be told within those towns. And I think that's great that you expand on that too, as kind of the central theme. What would you say was something when you were traveling across the country in the past, several years or so, since you were younger, that really stuck out to you that you said, I wanted to see more of this, and kind of started the was kind of like the starting point to want to see more different towns, different locations across the country, even possibly even before you started putting them on paper?
That's a good question because this actually goes back all the way back in I was like, look at the date. It was actually 9 years ago. My mom and I, we traveled to McAllen, Texas, during August of 2017. We were there for like a month, and that was the month, when Hurricane Harvey happened. We only got like a little bit of bad rain and, some wind, some gusts, but that was pretty much it. And because as a result, like, my flight to go back home was delayed, and there was no other airport close to me to actually go back to because I had to go back for work. And I called my airline, explained the situation, and the airlines, they knew what was going on. They understood. They were like, so they offered me they were able to get me a ticket from the Brownsville airport all the way back to Chicago on this day. And I said, like, that works for me. So then, come, on that day, my parents dropped me off. It was like a 4 or 5 in the morning. Actually, it was a 6 a.m. flight, I believe. And the trip took me from I flew from Brownsville to DFW airport, the big airport that's in the Dallas Fort Worth area. I bring that up because there's two airports. So I remember when I was just walking through the airport by myself, mind you, because it's my first time ever, like, being at the airport, traveling, by myself, even though it was with my mom, but my mom had to stay back, for other reasons. But I was just walking through, DFW, taking the train that goes around the airport because it's so big. And I was just like, solo traveling is so much fun. Like, this is something I see myself doing because, like, there's just so much to this place. And I know it was just at an airport, but something about it just gave me this spark to just want to just travel by myself, like, and explore across the country because I just felt unafraid of doing that. And that's what started my travels.
Okay. Was there any specific, what was your first, I guess, locate solo travel destination that really kind of helped you kickstart, the idea of transitioning into the horror element, being a lifelong horror fans, both of us are. What would you say is a town that kind of said, okay, horror was my main thing I was going to go to? Because obviously we're fans of different genres, but what would you say was that city or town or location that kind of really kicked off and said horror is going to be my thing? Even prior before even starting the idea of your first novel.
I think, let me think. That's a very good question because I haven't really thought of that because I'm trying to think of the places that I went to. Honestly, probably Seattle. And Seattle, probably for I think visiting there the third or fourth time, I think that's when I knew I was like, okay, my career has to be something in horror. What is it? I have no idea, but I knew like my mind was set on it, even though I've loved horror my whole life. But I just knew right then and there, Seattle, like I want to be able to like write my experience, but not like be so direct about it, but like somehow translate that into a storytelling perspective into it. But yeah, I think Seattle, Washington was the go-to, was like the turning point of wanting to start into writing horror.
And with the anthology aspect of it, would you say that because there's so much that you've experienced in your traveling to the past, 9 years, so since that time, since you went when we were in McAllen, Texas, was that a big contributing factor to why you want to do anthologies to kind of break up the stories and kind of add more content within each novel? Because everything's just it's so complex, so many different stories to tell, as opposed to just making one solid novel strictly on one storyline, expanding that more. With anthologies, we love anthologies, but there's only so much you can fit in. So was that kind of a way for you to kind of capture more content with each location because of anthology, or was it something more beyond that?
I think what it has to do is that like each story that I've written, like each story, or just five stories, each place it takes place in a different city. I've either visited, traveled to, lived, or just something I've just driven across, if that makes sense. So, um, I would. Sorry, what was your question again? I kind of got sidetracked.
No worries at all. Because you traveled so much and there's just so much things you've seen in each location, city, town, on the road, is that would you say that was probably something that inspired you or prompted you to go into writing anthology, specifically anthology fiction, rather than just making one solid story, for your first novel? Or was it because there's so much more content to share because of how many times you traveled? So do you think that was probably an easier path to go to make shorter stories based off these locations rather than just one large story covering one specific setting?
I think what it has to do is since I've always been the type to hold on to memories. I've always reminisced in the past, and I think with thinking about each place I travel to, I've always honed in on writing something about that town, just grabbing a piece of it. Just like grabbing that piece of memory I have of that place and just blossoming it into something, like into a story,
Hmm.
and that's and like something small, definitely not novel length. I'm not I as of right now, I don't think I have the capability to write a novel because there's just so much to put in, so
Yeah.
much work and so much details to think about. So I think the small little memories I have about each place I travel to, I think really kind of helps, helps blossom into this small little story I just think of, when I think of this place or something like that.
No. And so travel has pretty much been the major, probably starting inspiration for all of it. Living in multiple locations and whatnot. That was probably the biggest thing that got you into writing. Just travel as a primary inspiration.
Yes, for this book, yes, traveling was definitely an inspiration because you just never know. Like when I went to each town, city, across the country, I've always wondered like what really goes on here. Like I mean, obviously, like the stuff I wrote is fiction, but it's just like
Mhm.
it does make me wonder, like what actually goes on in these towns. Like if I stay long enough and if I stay involved into the communities,
Yeah.
like one of my stories takes place in Bainbridge Island, not Bainbridge Island. Actually, yeah, that is one of them. But like the story that I'm thinking of, it takes place in a town called Anacortes, Washington, which is basically like an hour and a half north of Seattle, and it takes you to like one of these like major islands, that Washington State is very famous for. So it always makes me wondering, like, what goes on here? Like, does anything crazy happen? At night?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's probably some magic into that too when you actually go to a location that's probably not that familiar. Growing up, we hear about the haunted houses across the country, the haunted locations, the cities and things like that. I think what you're doing as far as going an extra mile, no pun intended, traveling into each location, it's almost like it's that curiosity. And then possibly I noticed that some locations become popular because of literature or because it's seen in film. So maybe you might be able to shed light on these locations. What location would you say surprised the most? Not necessarily inspired the book locations specifically, but just in general, as far as like traveling, that you may have not, maybe you may have written about, or you may have thought or currently thinking about it, or maybe like something you'd want to write about later on. Um,
Um, so yeah, I think one of them, definitely like one of my stories, it's my second story, The Blossoming Prescription. I think there was something very interesting, when I went to Seattle and then I went to Bainbridge Island. Bainbridge Island, for those of you that don't know it, is right across from Seattle. You just take the ferry, and there was just something about like just taking the ferry that just felt like, I don't know, it just felt surreal, and it felt like I
mhm.
was walking into a whole different universe, a whole different
Yeah.
world, because Bainbridge Island is very different from
Mhm.
Seattle.
Oh, for sure too. Growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area myself, ferry rides were just that was such an amazing thing to just be in there and just being on the water and kind of seeing the islands from afar, things like that, locations, and just kind of taking it all in. I can definitely see that being a big inspiration for sure. The titles for these stories to move into the creation of the five stories, so not as location based, but the overarching themes. So we all know the road that tolls is inspired by your travels across the country. As far as the themes of each title, not to give too much away here, but what would you say was a central point of coming up with the titles and the themes for them? Despite we all know the overarching again is a theme is the traveling aspect, but the specific stories themselves too.
So like, is your question more so like what is the theme of each story?
Or what
Or
was the inspiration between each theme, for the titles that you shared, that we have here? We have, five stories here. What would you say was an inspiration for the theme of each one
okay,
individually,
so yeah,
without
for
giving away
starters,
too much, for the viewers?
no, no, it's all good. So let me go through like kind of the inspiration or the theme one by one. So for Such Sweets Nothing, it's a absurd slapstick, think of your, like killer tomatoes kind of story, where it's just very like
Mhm.
SNL-y, in terms of like in terms of like that slapstick comedy, like scary movie basically, like especially the new one, and especially some of the, especially like scary movies 3 and 4, they kind of have like that, that slapstick element to it. So that kind of inspired me, for that. And I've always wanted to get into writing, like horror comedy, and I think Such Sweets Nothing was my opportunity. And also like watching Drag Me to Hell also gave me some kind of
Mhm.
inspiration too, because it's so absurd and
The
out
thousands
of the
classic right
ordinary.
there. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And then now moving driving on over to the Blossoming Curse scripture, that is actually one of my more like thematic psychological like terror stories. It was inspired by something personal that happened to me in Seattle, which was 8 years ago. Let's just say I almost did something in Seattle that really took a nasty toll on me, and it's one of those experiences that those situations that left a scar on me, and I've felt like that a piece of me died on that day, and I've never really felt the same ever since. So then moving on over to Suburban Glitch, it takes place in my hometown that I'm at right now, which is Streamwood, and I wrote this from the inspiration of wanting to write like a technological tech horror game story. So I remember one day I was just playing, Super Smash Brothers Ultimate, and I've always when I was playing that game, it just made me wonder, like what happens, when what happens in the game, like does as like I've always like wanted to like playing this game, does something like this ever happen in real life? And I think that question was what drove me to answer into writing, Suburban Glitch. And that's a trippy story. And then moving on over to my fourth story, it has like a desert theme to it. It's called Dead Getaway.
I
Even
love that
though
title.
it's a fictional fantasy world of
Mhm.
where like everyone is skeletons and it takes place in the deserts, but like like there's no real correlation of the US into it, but given it's like my travels, driving through, I picture this story taking place in between, New Mexico and the Colorado area because of its desert theme setting. And that one's more like a cold uh yeah, a cold, psychological horror story. That's how I see that. That's how I wrote that book. And a little bit, like domestic, situational, like abusive relationship, because let's just say there's some things going on between the two main characters. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That was actually, I think that's one of my oldest short stories I've written, fun fact, during that timeline of writing this book. And then driving on over to my final story, which is like my most recent story that I wrote, and it was summer last year. It's the final delivery to sundown. So what inspired me to write that story was uh, because I used to do a lot of Uber Eats and DoorDash, and I would do overnight delivery here in Streamwood. And some of the places I delivered to at like 2 or 3 in the morning, like some of these places were pretty sketchy, and it gave me like really uncomfortable vibes. And I think I was able to grasp onto those emotions and to those emotions and just translate that into writing into this social horror story, because it gives a little bit of Get Out, but even though that's not what really inspired me, but it just it's just I was just more so inspired, by like my personal experience. So this one's actually like more personal to me.
Hmm. No, I love that. I love that you're also incorporating those personal elements to each story too. And there's pieces of your own life inside each story. I think that just kind of adds to the authenticity of each story, regardless of what subgenre may be part of. Horror comedy, horror fantasy. Speaking of the subgenres, how do you determine what goes into the novels per se? When you first wrote Critic Valley, were you thinking more so I need to put a horror comedy, a more horror fantasy, a more horror thriller? Was it kind of just a gamble and just kind of throwing them all in together? And do you feel like now with the release of the For the Road That Tolls coming out, do you feel there's more of a, I guess, an organization to it where you have to have one horror fantasy, one horror thriller, psychological, like all the subgenres. Horror is such a big expanding universe now with so many subgenres. Um, Sports horror is a thing now. So I mean, do you feel like you kind of have to like going forward possibly space out a little bit and surround it with the kind of add that diversity of each subgenre, despite the overarching theme?
So I think for these stories, I did want to I did want to explore other, subgenre, because I don't want to like make all of my 5 stories like, like psychological horror, because I think it would have I having 5 stories of like the same kind of like subgenres would kind of like lose like flavor and taste into my book, if that makes sense. So I wanted to like uh try other, try other subgenres, but keep it within like the same theme of driving. But like, because I wrote these stories because I just want to give my readers a different a different a different kind of subgenre, so that way they don't read the same thing. They don't read the same kind of like centralized, genre over and over. That makes sense. I know I'm being repetitive with that word. So
No worries. No, I like that. Yeah, I think because sports such a sports horror is such a large. There's so much different elements to it now. There always has been. I think now we're seeing, especially in this generation, we're seeing horror going to a lot of different types of subgenres as well too. Blending in, with horror comedy being a thing, but other additional factors to it as well too. So I can only just imagine what it's like to have to separate, like, you know, and to make them work too is another thing too. Kind of make them all tie in. We have a lot of anthology horrors where same shared universe, but how do you fit a psychological thriller story happening in this location as opposed to horror comedy happening in this location, but still having like an overarching like story universe, as you will. So I think that's really great because I think that symbolizes just how expansive a story or universe can be, just like the country with all these different stories coming into it as well. So I think that's a great concept to do that too. And I love the titles, by the way, too.
thank
Coming up
you.
with the titles in general too. That's another thing I want to touch on is like the creativity of them too. How they just kind of come to your mind and like, oh, this looks like it will work for this. Do you try to write according to the title, or kind of let the title come after as the writing's already been flowing and the story's about to be completed?
I think it's a mix of three of what you just mentioned. So because like some of the stories I've written, like the title only came up after I finished it. I might have put up like a tentative title, but I might have later changed it.
Mhm.
But I do know for a fact my final story, like, yeah, I think I did come up with it like right after. And I told myself, I remember this last year because it was actually fresh. It's so fresh into my head. I was like, don't think of a title until after, you finish the story. And yeah, and I came up, the title, Final Delivery Sundown. Yeah, I came up with it right after I finished it. But like I knew it was gonna be delivery something. I just didn't know what. And then, for let's say, Dead Getaway, actually funny enough, a lot of my titles are actually inspired by songs that I've listened to. So for example, Dead Getaway, the word getaway was actually, I took that word from the song Getaway Car by Taylor Swift. So I was, because I mean that story, a lot of the setting just takes place, just them driving, or them, them on the run, from something. And as well as, the one of my, to bounce over one of my stories, Such Sweet's Nothing. It was actually inspired by a Florence the Machine song. It's an old song from hers, but it's called, I think it was called, I think it is called Such Sweet Nothing or something like that, or Sweet Nothing. But either way, it was inspired from a title of a song. And then Suburban Glitch, I actually came up with this title right before Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift released her Taylor's version of 1989 with her Revolt tracks, because one of the songs that she has in Revolt was called Suburban Legends. And I'm trying to remember, like, did I come up with this title before or after she announced the release of her? No, actually, I actually don't remember. But either way, like, Suburban Glitch was something that was inspired by Taylor Swift. I'm just trying to remember whether or not like I came up with the title before or after she revealed her track list. But either way, it was Taylor inspired. And then for the Blossoming Curse scripture, I don't think there was any kind of like inspiration of a song to it. I just know like one of the main central focal points of the book is that there's a grave that the main character looks at, and it just appears out of nowhere, and that's where that title of the Blossoming Curse scripture comes up, because there's some writing in that tombstone. And then for the final delivery to sundown, I mean, sundown, I think we all know what the meaning of that. Because last year, a couple of my friends, a couple of my old friends and I, we talked a lot about like sundown towns, like places to stay away from around the country in general. So I kind of took that inspiration too, into forming that title and to forming that tone and atmosphere and the mood for that story.
Okay. I one thing I always liked is how, as you mentioned, the music inspiring titles. I think this kind of comes to where, art kind of feeds off art in a way too. Art, literature, music, film, all of those, anything. I think kind of feed off each other to inspire. As far as inspiration comes from anything, it's great to see that you're able to pull from things from your daily life, from your travels to the certain music that you like or the songs you listen to. I think it all combines to an overall arching story, overall story within yourself too and your journey. Which I want to also touch base with 200 journey. So I know we spoken before too. You officially started this writing journey officially in, correct me if I'm wrong, from November 2022 is when you mentioned that it was at the first time you decided, I'm going to start writing before Cryptic Valley was even released. That was like your thing. Take us back a little bit to that day or that month or whatnot. Like, what was going through your mind when you put that pen to paper or hands to keyboard, however you decide to write it initially, the first drafts of each story or the first story, and also kind of dive into like where we're at now, going at 4 years since then with this
I'm actually getting kind
possibility.
of sorry, I'm getting kind of emotional just thinking about November 2022 because that was like one of the best months I've ever had, by far, in a long time because to preface this, I was living in McAllen. I was working at I wouldn't say, I don't want to say it's a dead end job, but I was working at an overnight, warehouse job, think of like Lowe's or Home Depot. And I mean, it really had nothing going for me. And I did not really have any inspiration. Like I did like have some sort of like inspiration to like write over the summer of 2022, but like I never really committed to just write, I like put pen to paper, if that makes sense. But it wasn't until when I watched the show Stranger Things that's when it really changed my life because Stranger Things had for when I watched it, it had really good writing, really good storylines. It had the acting, the scenes, the action, all that. It really made me think like I can write a story that's just as good as Stranger Things, and if not better. So when I finished season 4, I was just in awe. I was in amazement for like a few days, and that's when I knew right then and then I was like, yeah, it's time for me to start writing. This was the time, and ever since then, the rest was history because I've written so many short stories, a lot more than what I've released or will be releasing so far. They're just waiting to be noticed.
Mhm. So the short stories, you have pretty much an archive, a little bit, so to speak, or maybe yeah, a collection of short stories that you're probably going to expand on in the future for future stories to make bigger for your future novels.
There are definitely like so for my book Cryptic Valley, there's a couple of stories in particular that I do see expanding that universe, that world, if that makes sense. I just gotta wait and see, how I feel about them. Like do I see continuation? Like am I feeling it? Like do I think, do I think, there's that possibility? We'll have to wait and see.
Mhm. No, definitely. When you wrote your first story, Fish before it was published in Crypto Alley, did you um how that sense of like completion feel? Like when it was officially done before it was even published in the novel, how that feel? Like what was going through your mind then? Like I finished my first actual story.
Like first actual story of the
Mhm.
book or just in general?
Of both.
I mean, to answer your question in both ways, like yeah, when I finished my first short story, and it only took me like 3 weeks, I was like, this was honestly the best feeling ever because like I've tried writing stories in the past, and I've never really finished it, so it always just bummed me out. But when I finished my first one, I was like, damn, I cannot believe I finished something I started it and I finished it. That was that was a really good feeling, and that just motivated me to keep going. Now for Cryptic Valley, I don't know how to approach the question because, like, I just read so many short stories, even some mini short stories, and I just compile them all together.
Mhm.
But I think, to kind of, to tug the book back to shore with your question, like when I finished everything, finalized on the book, on the cover and everything, like, yes, that gave me that feeling. I was like, damn, I cannot believe like this is actually real. Like
Mhm.
this is happening. It was a fever dream for me to finish
Yeah.
publishing the book.
I'll bet to just to know that you have that on there. It's out for order for those who are viewing right now. Definitely order a copy when you can. Um, I can only just imagine, especially how far you've come to. You're approaching 4 years since November 22nd. We decided to, I'm sorry, November 22. You actually decided to put the pen to paper and actually start writing. What are some things you have going on? When you look back at this during the past 3.5+ years, and looking at where you started then, though, how do you feel as far as your momentum coming into not just with the release of For the Road That Tolls coming, but in general for future novels?
I honestly, I think the momentum, yeah, I really haven't stopped. Like I treat like writing as more like working out, because I remember when I started working out like 11 years ago, like I remember I started staying consistent. Like I kept going to the gym every single day, nonstop. I would never, well, back at the time, I would not really skip the gym. I was just like part of my everyday routine. So now to like go back into writing, like yeah, I think about every single day. What am I going to write? How am I going to advance the story? And how am I going to finish it? Like when should I finish it? Like how should I fix this part? So that momentum has never. I've kept the momentum going. And even when I took a pause in school, because I was in school for this past year, I did not write. I mean, I tried writing a story, but I never really finished it. And I remember, like, as this past semester was ending, I told myself, I was like, I'm gonna write so many stories. Like, I already have like ideas just floating around my head. Like, I know what I'm gonna do this summer, and I told myself I was gonna write and film my short film. That's another story. And ever since I finished the semester, like I actually finished writing one story, and it took me like a little over 3 weeks, and I was 49 pages into the story.
Wow. And looking back, what would you say was probably the biggest, I guess you could say, challenges in between then? As far as you look at your growth from November 2022 up until now, too, what are some of the lessons you learned as being a writer? And as far as the things also that you've learned within yourself and your capabilities as a writer?
Sometimes the best stories that you write are the ones that you just come up with on the spot. Because I know I've heard people say that that they would have to draft a story, like create the characters, like outline who the characters are. I've tried doing that once, and it did not really work out for me because because when I translated that into paper, to writing the story, like I just never really finished it because I always felt like I had to like stick to what I wrote my outline. I could not mentally make any changes to it. So I scrapped that process, and I just wrote whatever was in my mind, and that's how I've really been doing it since. Cause and another lesson too, it's just like sometimes there's a lot of things, that you just can't juggle. Like I could not write while in school at the same time because it was hard. It was a very difficult thing for me to balance. You just gotta have a lot of time to yourself to get that thought process going, get that creative process going, and just write.
I can only imagine too, like, juggling school or responsibilities too, because I know some people I've spoken to before, they have this mindset of you have to go all in this only, which is great in some cases, but some things don't work. Some things only work for certain people, depending on situations. I think is a probably big takeaway. For you to actually get that done during school, you probably realize maybe within yourself, like, okay, I have to take this break to get some more mental clarity to write, but not forgetting that I'm still in school learning and growing, in your craft and everything like that too. So I think it really depends probably what works for certain people. I know some people are more laser focused, have to write out a whole screen first, or not screenplay, write the whole, write the story, lay out the characters, the settings, all that. And I've also spoken with some individuals too where it's literally just put the pen on the paper or start typing away and then just kind of go with it, let the mistakes happen later. What advice would you give to someone who is looking to start a short story or a novel in its own right, that you, as someone's about to publish your second one, with stories in it, as an anthology, just first that one individual who probably wants to write their first initial like story, no matter how long it may be, could be part of an anthology, maybe a bigger, maybe something bigger, like maybe a novel itself too, not just in the horror genre, but in general too. What advice would you give to someone who is about to release their second novel within a couple of weeks?
Just write it. Just write the whole thing out. Don't overthink it. Just write it out like it's word vomit, and just start writing. Like, write. Write or just write whatever is going on in your head, write that idea, even if it's all convoluted, just start writing, just start from point A and finish all the way to point Z. You can fix the mistakes later.
I like that too. Yeah, I think some. Do you feel like some a lot of times a lot of people get so caught up in they get or they overanalyze a little bit? Not that you have to like you have to have some kind of strategy to it. Do you feel like some people, maybe individuals you maybe worked with or went to school with for writing, probably have that mindset they have to have all of it set here, lay out this character, that character, as opposed to just kind of going with it? Because I always hear different things. Like some people are more strategic, some people are more like just go with it. How do you find a balance of like when you're doing your writing, like, oh, hey, I actually have to like take a step back and maybe work on this character's development a little bit more, or maybe expand on this setting, in case you reach those moments, because writing the story is great and all. Um, but these are times we have to kind of have to pause a little bit and say, okay, let me like rethink and maybe make a change to the setting, or maybe this character's going to have this development or backstory instead. Or does that come on the whim too, not necessarily taking a step back and looking at the character and evaluating them, but actually saying, but just kind of like thinking, oh, this person's now going to be this person. Like, how does that process work as you write with the changes and adjustments?
So yeah, you did hit on what you mentioned earlier. It is a little bit of both. So I remember when I was writing my short story that I wrote like a few weeks ago, when I would pause on writing for the day, I would actually, and when I would not, when I would try to figure out like how to approach the story next, what I would do is I would, write down on my notes saying like, oh, here are the bulletin points, and like here's how we're gonna advance the story forward. Like that way it just makes a lot of logical sense. Like, oh, like, we could, like I could write about like, oh, I could, write on my bulletin points and like, oh, let me create a little backstory on this character, but don't make it like 20 pages of a backstory because that's boring as shit. So just a few bulletin points, just to keep the momentum going, the story going. That way I wouldn't lose interest. And yeah, and then the next day, like I would, resume back, writing, like like check marking all the bulletin points I listed and just move the story on from there. And honestly, like in terms of like building the character, like yeah, some backstory is great, but also too like let the action speak for itself of the character. Don't let don't let too much of the words, or like don't like narrate so much for the character. Let the character speak for themselves. That's how I usually approach these characters.
Oh, it's beautiful. No, like I think sometimes, especially for younger writers, younger in the craft itself, like I think there's probably that initial, where to begin. I think that's the biggest thing. Like they always say, beginning is a starting point. You're halfway there, and sometimes people, they may overanalyze, overthink it. But I think initially putting it on paper, probably starting to write it, let the edits happen, let the character changes happen, the adjustments that's needed, those can happen during the editing phase. I think it's just probably getting over that initial like fear or anxiety or whatever it may be to actually start writing. Possibly, did you feel that was something for you, that kind of, now that you're in this mode where you're about to release this novel, and obviously I'm sure that those like, with all the stories you've already written that aren't even published yet, it's probably already you've gone over those anxieties. You still have those anxieties a little bit, possibly,
Like when it comes to like starting a new story.
or just like, yeah, a new story, or maybe just like, do you get hesitation, even the slightest, sometimes when you're writing a new story? Like, all right, let me rethink. What can I pick up from where I left off in the last novel or last stories?
I don't get so much like anxiety. It's more like I think there's a lot that goes on in the thought process before I put it into paper or start typing it out. There's not much anxiety, especially because you mentioned about novels, or picking up where I left off. Like, especially when I mean I can't write a whole story in one day. It takes a lot. But like when I go back to pick up, I'm like, okay, I I summarize like mentally, here are the details and here's how I approach, because here's how I approach, like moving forward. Because some of the ideas, like let's say I think of for this, like how I want to move the story into this direction, I usually forget within like an hour or two, and I go into this direction instead. And it's still fine with me. Like I don't sweat over it. So it's as long as like I can get to point Z by the end. Like this is the this what the what this is what the end result of the story has to be. Like how do I get to it? Like I could find there could be lots of obstacles to get there. But yeah, no, there's barely an anxiety for me writing the story. Like like it's like I treat like working out. It's part of my everyday routine. I've been doing this. I've been working out for over 11 years, and I've been writing for
Mhm.
3.5 years. It's just part
Yeah.
of my everyday routine. If I get anxious about every day, then it's just not worth being nervous over. And being nervous every day, it just causes too much stress, and it just drains me physically and mentally.
Mhm.
So
Oh, that's a great thing. That's a great answer. Thank you for sharing that aspect too. Yeah, I know sometimes some people may possibly, get that initial fear of this, of writing because they're thinking long term. But like you said, live in the moment, just kind of focus on it, and you'll get better with the repetition. Is pretty much the big thing. Okay, going to publishing and marketing the book too. I know that's kind of its own. It's one thing to write the novel, write the stories, edit them, make them the best versions that they can be. Let's dive into the marketing self-publishing aspect. First, let's start with the marketing aspect. Actually, I'm sorry. Let's start with the self-publishing aspect of it too. Uh, Speak a little about that journey as self-publishing. Becoming a self-publishing author, like routes you had to take, connections you had to make. It's a very, we're assumingly for many of us, it's a lot of work that has to be done to publish yourself and to market yourself. So that journey becoming self-publishing, how would you describe that from start to when we first started?
I mean, it is a lot of work. I'm not gonna lie because with self-publishing, like you just because like you have a like just because you own your work does not mean like you may necessarily own your own work, if that makes sense, because I'm self-publishing my books through Amazon, and Amazon does own a lot of my royalties. And also too, if you want to get your own ISBN, which is basically the social security for books. To get your own ISBN, you have to purchase them yourself. Or if you don't want to get one, Amazon can provide their KDP, or Kindle ISBN, but you would lose a lot of rights should you take that route. What kind of rights do you lose? I'm not sure about that, but yeah, self-publishing, like you have to put so much details into it. A lot of it. You have to design. You have to like get your own graphic designer if you want to design your own book cover, because I mean Amazon could provide a book cover for you, but it will most likely be something that you do not like. So it will most likely something that would turn readers off, because I know people say we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but also too, like, a book cover can determine whether or not a reader would be interested in reading
Ah,
it. Just like movies, with trailers, or like looking
mhm.
at posters, like, is this something
Or
that interests
Blockbuster
you?
back in the day for all us 90s people. I remember the first thing that came out of mind was I remember going to that video store as a kid in the 90s. I'm aging myself now. A lot of times we didn't care about the content of the movie. Like we get now, we see a big synopsis. It's literally, especially in the horror genre, that movie looks scary. All you see is that cover art and you just instantly grab it off the shelf. You don't even know much about the story, at least not as a kid. You just kind of pick it. So I kind of related to that too. It's actually just brought up some fun memories looking back, nostalgia as you will. But no, definitely, I think that's the thing too. People are, you have to have drawn to. That's part of the selling aspect of it too, in marketing. The book itself. Not saying the content is good, but what's going to actually pull the person in. Where the art or whatever is in there, the content is good. You at least want to have a good starting point as a good cover, right?
Yes, definitely good cover. And that's a good thing about self-publishing too, because I heard with a majority of publishers, like they'll choose a cover or a graphic designer for you. You don't have a lot of say, in choosing your own book cover. So, but the good trade-off about like publishing with getting an agent to publish your book is that like you do get a lot of market exposure, which is something that self-publishing does not have. You pretty much have to do your own marketing, do your own kind of promotion, teasers and all that stuff, all through you.
Hmm. Yeah. How is that as far as getting your name out there with the self-publishing? There's probably a lot of times, or maybe not your case, but for some people, like it's a lot of probably it probably gets a little overwhelming sometimes too, having to find the right person that's going to pick up the book or you know, sell, promote it for you, right?
Yeah, that's a difficult process, but I don't really want to go to people and beg, for like their endorsement sponsorship. I just let just things happen naturally. What I usually do, for my advertising, I'll post, especially with this book, I barely did any marketing for Cryptic Valley, but now with this one, I was like, okay, let me do a little more, like intensive, like story posting, posting on my Instagram story, making posts about it on Instagram, and I started now doing it on sorry, promoting my book, my book release on Facebook. So yeah, because I'm just at this point in my life where like I just don't care what other people think anymore. Like I just need to do my own thing, get myself out there. And
Yeah.
if people don't want to be a part of that journey, that's fine with me. I could not care less at this point. It's just more of me, like I gotta stop pleasing others, otherwise I will lose myself in the process and not have the creative success that I look for it. And especially, if I would regret if I didn't put a lot of effort into it, if that makes sense. Sorry, I got a little distracted, my computer just turned off.
No, no, I like that too. It's actually a good segue to one of the final points. But like you said too, um, in this journey in the past almost 4 years since you wrote your first story, leading up to Critic Alley, like it's pretty much to the point to where you learn so much about yourself in the process that now you mature as not just as you write, but the journey itself. 'Cause writing is just part of the journey. Obviously, we covered publishing, marketing, but also just as a creative in general too. The things you learn about yourself, I think that's a really valuable lesson to take as you continue this journey onto the future novels and the future creative projects that you do in film and other ventures too. I think that's something that a lot of people may need to hear. Um, is it's a journey. You're going to grow within it. You're going to learn some do's and don'ts. You're going to learn more about what worked then, what maybe not work this time around, especially in society changing a lot too. Um, but I think that's a great concept as far as, you just don't have you just can't waste time anymore. It's either you're in it or you're not, because, probably initially, a lot of times people, they want to see what's going to grab the attention of certain viewers. Maybe they aim for a certain demographic, of individual when they write something, when they create something. But I think the best way, and I think you're mastering great, is when you go in, whoever gets it, gets it. Whoever understands it. Whoever doesn't, that's fine, because other people will. And I think that's a great thing to take for any creative person like yourself to go in. And I think you've done a good job with that. I think you've built an audience and a fan base and continue to build one now to where more people, regardless of each story, they might like a story a lot, may not like this one, but they know behind that story is a creative that's willing to do whatever it takes and put it all on the line and is there to entertain, is there to actually bring good stories and bring good content out there that people can understand. That it's hit or miss with a lot of people, for sure, even those you choose to work with. So I think that's probably one of the biggest valuable things in this journey too, that you're going to learn as you filter and venture into different projects as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, appreciate that.
Yeah, that segues into speaking of lessons too. For this specific book in general, as we're approaching it, come releasing, I don't mention that already in the next couple of weeks. What was, as you could say, some of the biggest lessons you learned from writing this second book? Like lessons about maybe yourself or just your own writing or how to market, perhaps. What are some of the biggest takeaways as opposed to when you
Honestly,
first book?
I honestly definitely like I think the lessons I learned was definitely just go all in, just jump in the
Mm,
pool and just start like building your identity and start crafting it. Just let it all loose, like the things you want to do, the things you want to post. Like if when in doubt, like, make that post, post that on your story, or like just post, that's what I tell myself. And like, and as for the stories, like, I think I love my first book. Don't get me wrong, but this book, I love this book. I love this coming book too, because it has like a very shared personal experience about it. And I think the lesson from there is, like, just everywhere you go, there's always something behind it. There's always something that goes on, good or bad. There's always something there for you. And it's always just, like whenever you're curious, just go there. That's the takeaway from the lesson that I learned from this book.
As far as adjustments made too, as you mentioned, the first one was great as it was, and this one you went all in more too. Do you feel like when you went all in for writing these stories, there was more of a freeing aspect? Do you feel like you were kind of potentially maybe a little bit playing it safe with the first little bit? When I say play it safe, I don't mean like too cautious or cautious at all, but more so just trying to get your foot in there a little bit, kind of play, kind of ease into it, go with kind of the basic formatting of the story, maybe all great stories, but kind of format a little bit. So it's like, okay, this is something that can easily be done. This might be more, I just say kind of more contained as opposed to now we're going all in where it's like, hey, this story's going to push those limits. It's going to go all in. It's going to take a toll, no pun intended,
Yeah.
on the mind. Love that aspect. So would you say that's probably a big thing about this book, or the one that's coming out, what's coming out in a couple of weeks, within a couple of weeks?
Yeah, it's more in depth. There's a central theme. There's like some thematic elements into it. Just think of like the movie The Others, or something like those like subtle suspense. Just
Hmm.
think of like where there's a message. There's a theme behind it. There's something that you'll like I can guarantee you like some of these stories like it will leave you resonate. It will leave you thinking a lot about like certain parts of the stories, like certain characters and all that stuff. Like yeah, and I think that's one thing I really like loved about writing this book is just being able to build a world behind it, like explore these characters, explore the character interactions, how they feel about being there, or how they think about the past. The past is like, I mean, the past, a lot of it, because one of the things about horror, is that like a lot of horror just comes from the idea like whatever you do in the past make will come back and haunt you,
Hmm.
or your future, or your actions, like you may the things you do right now may not, you may not get the consequence of it, but it will come back and haunt you later. Like that's another huge theme of mine, and I forgot to kind of bring this up earlier, is the idea that the past will come back to haunt you. And I think that's a central theme in some of these stories.
Wow, no, that's very true. um the past is the past, we leave in the past, but some elements still kind of carry over, generationally even too. With that being said, can we get a look at the cover art if it's able for us to see it
Yeah,
for the
I did
viewers
post this
out
on
there?
I did post this on my Instagram and my Facebook, but let me see if I'm able to like let's see if it's visible. I know it's a little painful to see with the glare and everything.
Like I said before, I like that it has that. To me, it had that kind of retro looking, 90s kid over here. So I love the art as far as how it looks there. As you see each stop, it's like each stop along the way. Then you get to the back. So for those that can't only see, definitely can look it up too for The Road That Tolls by Ulysses Wilkinson, coming out July 7th, 2026, in just a couple of weeks. But yes, I'm excited to read the novel as well too. I've already got my copy getting pre-ordered as we speak. Any closing comments before we wrap it up as we go?
Yeah, pre-order is available on July 7th. So there's no way for anyone to just pre-order right now, but like to close it out, like just get my book. And I know it sounds very cheesy when I say that, but honestly, just okay, I don't know. To close it out, I really think that this book is gonna be one of those books that really leaves you with insightful thinking, and it just makes you wonder, like, damn, I cannot believe I read that. Like, there's something about these stories that really will leave you, will make you, your heart shatter or your jaw drop, because, like I said, the stories will take you on a wild journey. Like, it's crazy.
Mhm. Well, that being said, we're all looking forward to being on a journey with you, not just within the story, but outside as well too, and following, documenting your journey as we go along, as you approach 4 years since you started writing. We're all looking forward to the next work and other projects too. We definitely just again some time, spooky season's right upon us, so let's reconvene then. Until then, I'm looking for the novel. Appreciate your time too, Ulysses. We're really excited, really happy for you that was his book coming out too. Those that don't have a copy of his first novel, please also order a copy of that as well too. I definitely recommend, and we'll go from there. Ulysses, it
Thank
was
you.
great talking to you too. Well, let's reconvene soon. With that being said, everybody,
Yeah.
spooky season on the corner. It's going to be a good one this year, so can't wait.
Yeah, thank you so much, Irvin, for interviewing me. I really appreciate that. And yeah, definitely just for everyone, just stick around for July 7th because that's when the book drops.
Mhm.
And that's when I like the way I see about the book is like that's when all mayhem will just let loose, you know. But yeah, stick around July 7th because that's when my book for the role that the tolls is out. Thank you, everyone.